On June 7th, 12 SS Panzer was led into action by Colonel Kurt Meyer of 25 SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment and quickly collided with troops of the 3rd Canadian Division moving on Carpiquet Airfield, west of Caen. These two divisions fought it out for the next 2 days, German tanks and Panzer Grenadiers against Canadian anti-tank guns and infantry. This battle was fought with notable ferocity, with few prisoners taken on either side, and little quarter given to those Canadians who did surrender. The soldiers of the 12th SS Panzer were mostly young men, 18 and 19 years of age, the same as most of the other German soldiers in Normandy, not children, as some have alleged, but all convinced Nazis and men not open to pity. On June 7th, Meyer's men shot 23 Canadian prisoners at the village of Buron, northwest of Caen, and the division continued to shoot prisoners and French villagers throughout the Normandy campaign, and there is little doubt that the Allied units shot SS prisoners in reprisal. Tough, ruthless, and well-trained though they were, 12 SS met their match in the Canadians, who beat off all attempts to break through to the sea, and were pushed back in a smart little action by the Marines of 46 Royal Marine Commando, attached to the Canadians around the village of Rotz. Bud Hess of the Fort Garry Horse, a Canadian regiment, gives us an account of the battle for Rotz. Rotz is a small village on a river near Carpiquet Airport, and with a tree-lined valley leading up to clusters of farm buildings, an easy place to defend. The Régiment de la Chaudière and the British commandos were making the attack. I do not know in what strength, but a squadron of the Fort Garrys went in as well, in support. During the whole day I cannot recall seeing any tanks apart from German ones, plus the 4 in my troop. We made our way down the valley for a couple of miles against light resistance, some on the right flank, until we reached the bridge into the village where there was a roadblock and plenty of defenders, where we had our first chance to try out our high-explosive shells. These would penetrate a building and explode inside, so in no time we had cleared the area and taken a few prisoners. This did not clear the road, so we went through the back gardens, and upon breaking through a row of trees, came on a group of Germans setting up a long-barreled gun about 20 feet in front of us. We were looking right down the spout and so close that we could not depress our gun to fire at it, so I drove up beside the Germans and slewed the tank round to throw the gun into the ditch. Then we proceeded into the village. Some heavy fighting had taken place in Rotz prior to our troop arriving. We were told that some of our tanks had been lost, but we did not see any until we emerged into the open and found a Tiger tank burning, so we knew that some of our tanks had passed this way. Then we met 2 Tigers that were very much alive. Luckily they were going away from us, and their guns were pointing the other way, so we were able to get in a couple of shots before they turned round. Unfortunately, our guns were not big enough to penetrate the Tiger's armour, and their 88mm could slice through ours like a hot knife through butter. It was frustrating to see the armour-piercing shells bounce off their thick hides. Maguire, our loader, was slamming in 75mm shells so fast that it sounded like machine gun fire, but every shot would bounce off. They were starting to fire back, and one of their shells creased us, but Maguire then loaded he, and we scored a hit right by the main gun, which went up in the air like a flagpole, and the German crew bailed out and left. The crew of the other Tiger had also gone, so one of our tanks must have hit it. Then we noticed that this cornfield we were in was crawling with Jerrys, herding quite a number of our boys back to their lines as prisoners, a process we were happy to reverse. We stayed in that forward position all night, along with a platoon of infantry, and I don't mind saying it was the longest night of my life. However, nothing developed, and at dawn we made our way back to our own lines, where the rest of the squadron welcomed us with open arms, thinking we had been killed. Later that day we recovered the damaged tanks and removed the bodies, your Uncle Bob among them. Another member of the Fort Garrys, Edwin Goodman of Toronto, gives his account of the Rotz battle. I was in the same squadron as Bob and Bud, and my tank was the last of the 4 into the village. As we went in, a mortar round landed on my turret, but I had half the cupola up, and that took the blast. Instead of blowing my head off, it only gave me a bad headache. As we passed the crossroads, there was a German Panther tank about 50 feet away, which fired its high-velocity gun at my tank. The shell went right through the turret, killed my loader and went out the other side. Within a few seconds, my tank was on fire. My gunner was scrambling to get out, and I pushed him through the top of the tank and onto the engine plates at the rear, where a German in the top of a house shot him dead, although that did not become known until the next day. The tank was now a mass of flames, and I threw myself out and onto the road. One of my men in another tank, which had been shot up, told me that he could see all this from the place where he was hiding, and that when I landed I was cursing the Germans with words he had not heard before. I then ran across the road and took cover in what the English call the corn. It was like running through a heavy rainstorm with bullets bouncing all around me, but I was not hit. The brigade liaison officer was in a small scout car which was also on fire, and as he tried to get out I could see his face, and he sank back into the flames. It was grim. By now I was hiding in the corn beside a commando corporal, and as we peered down the road we saw some Germans walking up to some Canadians hiding in the corn and killing them. My commando partner said, "Let us get a couple of those guys before they shoot us," and I said, "I have no weapon." He therefore gave me his commando knife, which was covered in blood. He told me he had already got one with his knife and told me how to use it. At that moment, two of my squadron's tanks, about 100 yards out in the field, started to fire at the Germans. Unfortunately, they almost hit my companion and I, so we pushed ourselves deeper in the corn. Not wanting to be killed by my own squadron, I decided we had better get up and take our chances, and we started to run towards Jerry Curtin's tanks. By the time we got to them, there were 13 of us, and we all climbed onto the back of one where the turret was not working. I then found the commando colonel and asked him what he wanted me to do. He looked at me, evidently I was pretty badly burned, and said I should take one of the non-working tanks and find my own headquarters. Once there, they sent me back to the Mulberry Harbour and thence to hospital in England, where I stayed for 3 weeks before rejoining my regiment. I really regret having to tell you this grim tale, and have no intention of telling you another. This tough fight at Rots by the Fort Garry Horse and the Royal Marine Commandos drove the Germans back to the Camp-Bayeux road. Even so, the 3rd Canadian Division's advance came to a halt at Auty and Carpiquet. The division's D-Day objective was not to be in their hands for several weeks. This was the case elsewhere on the Allied beachheads. On June 7th, most of the units, American, British and Canadian, were still attempting to take or secure the objectives listed for June 6th, so a short résumé of the situation on the first day of the battle for Normandy will be useful. On June 7th, the British 50th Division completed their occupation of Bayeux and sent patrols probing south along the River Seulles towards Tilly-sur-Seulles and Longues, where they would shortly bump into Panzer Lehr. Back on the coast, No. 47 Royal Marine Commando had completed the capture of Port-en-Bessin and made contact with American troops of the US 5th Corps edging east from Omaha. Linking up the British and Canadian beaches would take a few more days, while isolated pockets of resistance were rooted out at Langrune-sur-Mer by No. 48 Royal Marine Commando on June 7th. It took longer at the radar station at Douvres-la-Délivrance, where the German garrison held out until June 17th. Overall, by the evening of June 7, the eastern edge of the invasion area from the Ranville Heights to Port-en-Bessin was relatively secure apart from a certain amount of sniping and probes from German fighting patrols. The same was largely true in the American sector west of Port-en-Bessin. Although the US First Army had not fully achieved any of its D-Day objectives, 5 divisions were ashore by the morning of June 7th. These divisions were short of tanks, artillery and supplies of food and ammunition, but they had moved off the beaches, which were still under artillery fire, and were either moving further inland or digging in to beat off counterattacks. The 2 airborne divisions in the Cotentin were gradually gaining strength as more men trickled in, increasing their grip around Sainte-Mère-Église and linking up with the 4th Infantry Division, which had now expanded its beachhead inland from Utah. It was now necessary for elements of 7th Corps to push south and east, past Carentan to Isigny, and link up with the 29th Division of 5th Corps, coming west from Omaha. This move was being strongly contested by the German 91st Division, dug in at the foot of the peninsula. The 2 assault divisions on Omaha, the 1st and 29th Infantry, were still recovering from the events of D-Day. During the assault, they had sustained over 3,000 casualties, about 1,000 for every mile of beach, and taken particularly heavy casualties among the officers and senior NCOs. However, the 29th Division, Major General Charles H. Gerhardt, landed its 3rd Regiment, the 175th Infantry, at noon on D+1, and both assault divisions began to move south, 1st Infantry keeping east of the Saint-Laurent-Formigny line, 29th Infantry to the west of it. The task of both divisions on June 7th was to reach the points they should have reached had all gone well on the previous day. At this time, all over the Allied front, men marked as missing on D-Day were returning to their units, among them Robert Sales, an infantryman of B Company, 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Division. D-Day was just terrible. I went in on the first wave with B Company, and before we got ashore, machine gun bullets were coming in as soon as the ramp went down. Captain Zappacosta, the company commander, was killed. The forward observers were killed. I caught my heel on the ramp and went off sideways, or I would have been killed. To this day, I never met another person who was in that boat, the headquarters boat for B Company. It was just a mixed-up affair. Then a few minutes later, a shell hit in the water and knocked me groggy. I was almost out of it. I met Dick Wright, communications sergeant and my friend for many years, lying out on the sand behind a log, and Dick raised up on his hand a little bit, and a sniper hit him in the head and he flopped down on the sand. Nothing could live on that beach that day. I had lost my radio and rifle in the water. It was just terrible, but some of us got behind a wall and all day we dragged the dead in. They came rolling in on the waves, shells landing, tanks landing. They had to land those tanks. As it began to get dark, a launch came in and took us off, all the wounded, and we got them onto a hospital ship. By the next day, though, I was feeling better. My senses were back to normal, so I went and found a doctor and said I did not want to go back to England. I wanted to go ashore and find my company, what was left of them, and he said that if I felt like going, that was fine with him. So I went up on deck where there was kit they had taken off the wounded, and I found a pistol and a rifle and a pack, and then I found a launch to take me back to the beach. I joined up with a recon outfit and spent 2 days with them, moving about the beachhead, asking where I could find the 116th Infantry Regiment, and eventually I found them. When I got back to B Company, they all came running out, thinking I had been killed. They were in a bombed-out area where there was a big church, and they had church services that night, and everyone went to church. And then we went into the hedgerow country and pushed towards St. Lo. At first, this advance from the Omaha beachhead went ahead without much trouble. The U.S. official history records slight or sporadic resistance and a marked degree of enemy disorganization, which had first been observed on the afternoon of D-Day. No enemy reinforcements appeared on June 7th, and the morale of those elements of the 352nd Division that had contested the U.S. landings on Omaha fiercely on the previous day now seemed low. The U.S. advance therefore took the high ground at Engrainville, although the 3rd Battalion of the 26th Infantry seemed unable to take the village of Formigny or get moving to the south, though only opposed by exhausted elements of the German 916th Regiment. The Germans were not finally driven out of Formigny until the morning of June 8th. This lack of resistance to the American advance from Omaha on D+1 may have been due to the fact that the commander of the 352nd Division, General Kreis, had other worries on June 7th, most notably the advance of the British 50th Division into and around his right flank at Bayeux. 50th Division should have been resisted by the 716th Division, stationed to the east of the 352nd, but the left wing of this division had apparently collapsed. The fighting around Bayeux on June 7th was confused, and it is not easy to make out where German units were or what they were doing, but it is clear that the 352nd Division was in trouble and unable to resist any determined advance by the Allied forces, let alone counter-attack them. 2 battalions of the British 56th Infantry Brigade, 50th Division, entered Bayeux early on June 7th, and by noon the city was in British hands. This advance, combined with that of the U.S. 1st Infantry Division from Omaha, pushed the remains of the 352nd Division into a pocket along the River Drôme, where both Allied divisions came to a halt along the riverbank. Meanwhile, the U.S. 29th Division spent the day mopping up enemy resistance just off the beach around Saint-Laurent and Vierville, still under sniper, machine gun and mortar fire from woods and farmhouses. The reserve regiment of this division, the 175th Infantry, was still offshore on the morning of June 7th and did not land until the late afternoon, when, as related, it was ordered west, towards Isigny. In the 7th Corps area in the Cotentin, the 4th Infantry Division had pushed the enemy back 2 miles from Utah, overrunning German coastal batteries that were firing on the beach and the offshore shipping, reaching the villages of Crisbec and Daudenville. The main threat to the U.S. positions in the Cotentin on June 7th came from a counter-attack mounted against the 82nd Airborne at Sainte-Mère-Église, a strong infantry attack from the direction of Cherbourg, supported by tanks and self-propelled guns. Rapid support from newly landed tanks of the 746th Tank Battalion from the 4th Division Reserve beat this attack off in the late afternoon. The Germans then withdrew to take up defensive positions in front of Montebourg, north of Sainte-Mère-Église, barring the road to Cherbourg and bringing up more men, tanks and guns to make further advance difficult. At the southern end of the Cotentin, the 82nd Airborne Division had difficulty in the flooded ground around the River Merderet, where early on June 7th they were counter-attacked by tanks and infantry. This attack was repulsed, but not without heavy losses among the American companies. Meanwhile, men of the 101st U.S. Airborne Division were in combat with Colonel van der Heiter's 6th Parachute Regiment on the River Douve and around Saint-Côme-du-Mont. In this engagement, the U.S. paratroopers managed to capture most of the 6th Regiment's 1st Battalion. On balance, June 7th saw the Allied forces doing as well as, or rather better than might have been expected. This can be attributed partly to surprise. The invasion was unexpected, largely because of the weather, partly to a lack of grip on the German side, probably due to the absence of Field Marshal Rommel, and partly to the overwhelming Allied superiority in aircraft and naval gunfire. The main problem facing the Allied troops ashore on June 7th was a shortage of supplies. Since this problem was to continue, it would be as well to examine the supply situation again. The Allied invasion had been planned for 2 years, and that may have been part of the problem. The invasion logistics had been prepared down to the last nut, bolt and jerry can, and in their attempts to get things right, the planners had forgotten that in war things inevitably and invariably go wrong. The logistical plan was therefore too tight, too exact, with no margin for error or accident, and it began to come apart on the first day. The first problem was the weather. The build-up of surf on the beaches on June 6th restricted the landing areas and prevented many craft discharging their cargoes. Other craft ran onto obstacles or hit mines or were sunk or damaged by shell fire, while store trucks stalled in the sea when their waterproofing proved inadequate. In the British sector alone, 258 landing craft of various kinds were lost on D-Day, and only about half the planned number of vehicles were put ashore. The weight of stores landed on the British and Canadian beaches was about 40% less than planned. On Omaha, all attempts to land stores were brought to a halt by German resistance, and many landing craft were lost, while on Utah the landing was made in the wrong place. It all helped to slow up the delivery of supplies. For the first 2 days, all the men had was the food and ammunition they could carry with them. These problems were compounded by the fact that the roads, fields and villages behind the beaches had to be cleared of mines and booby traps. Gaps and craters had to be filled, bridges repaired. All this took time and slowed up the forward movement of supplies. This situation was slightly eased by the fact that the Allied advance was not proceeding as quickly as planned. Those damned Germans kept getting in the way, so the Allied supplies had less distance to travel. However, the factor that compounded all this was the first one mentioned: the Allied logistical plan was too rigid. Only 100 tons of shipping per day had been put aside for emergency use, roughly 1% of the total planned, which implies that the planners assumed their loading and unloading schedules would work out 99% of the time, an optimistic assessment to say the least. The end result of this, and one becoming apparent as early as D+1, was that the logistic plan began to falter. Storeships and landing craft began to assemble off the beaches later that day, demanding places to beach and unload. Back in England, the storemen at the invasion ports were staring anxiously out to sea, looking for ships that should have been back from Normandy by now, ready to reload and sail again, but had somehow failed to return. Meanwhile, the construction of the Mulberry harbours, one at Arromanches for the British and one at Omaha for the Americans, began on D+1, but here again there were problems. The British Mulberry had already lost 40% of its component parts and was never able to handle its designed amount of cargo, and, as we shall see, the Omaha Mulberry was soon destroyed in a gale. No immediate help there then, but shortages were already worrying the troops ashore, so on D+2, the existing logistical plans, so painfully and carefully constructed, were largely committed to the wastepaper basket. Ships were to go in where they could and unload all they had, regardless. It was messy and it caused confusion, but it was better than not having the goods on shore at all. By the end of D+1 on the American front, not more than a quarter of the planned 14,500 tons of stores had actually been landed. Fewer than half the 14,000 vehicles had come ashore, and the troop build-up was already 20,000 men short. The saving element on the supply front, at this time and later, was the hard work and ingenuity put into the task of supplying the frontline soldiers by the troops in the supply chain. Whatever the book decreed as the maximum possible, the service units managed to exceed it, in tons of stores unloaded, in gallons of pole supplied, in miles driven. Allied success in the Battle of Normandy owes a great deal to the unsung heroes in the supply lines, the men at the rear who kept the food, fuel and ammunition flowing to the men at the front. Their labour and enterprise also compensated for a failure to take ports in accordance with the planned schedule. This schedule had been drawn up in order that the logistical staffs could plan their deliveries, but the ports were not taken on time or were unusable when taken. Cherbourg, which the Americans planned to take in a matter of days, came on stream 6 weeks behind schedule. Granville and Saint-Malo, which the American commanders hoped to have functioning by D+27, were still in German hands on D+50. Other ports, Isigny or Port-en-Bessin, Courseulles, Ouistreham in the British and Canadian sectors, though in Allied hands, were simply too small. These problems would not go away. To sum up the gains so far, the Allied advances on June 6th to 7th, however limited, had forced the German units away from the coast. The Germans had fallen back in defiance of Hitler's firm order that every metre of ground was to be contested, because they had no choice. Allied pressure was simply too strong. Shelling from the relentless guns of the Allied fleets, backed from the air by the light bombers and ground attack fighters of the US 9th Air Force and 2nd TAF, had rendered Hitler's order impossible, but by the evening of June 7th, the invaders were starting to flag and their forward push slowed. This too was inevitable, for the men were tired. The men in the assault and follow-up divisions, American, British, Canadian, had not slept or rested for 3 days or more, not since they boarded their troop transports on June 4th. It should be remembered that they were supposed to go ashore on June 5th, and the assault was delayed by the weather. Crammed craft and seasickness do not make rest easy, and the euphoria of getting ashore, even where it still existed after the first blast of enemy fire, had long since evaporated. The men ashore were now short of food, extremely short of ammunition, and in urgent need of rest, resupply and reinforcement. They were, however, extremely optimistic, and with good reason. Although the beaches had not yet been combined into a single bridgehead, the US official history is correct when it states for June 7th that, in general, it was clear that the invasion had succeeded in gaining a foothold. The build-up race was on. The battle for the bridgehead, June 8th to 12th. The failure of both 5th and 7th Corps to make any substantial moves toward the vital joining of the beachheads, together with the general slowness of the advances on D-Day objectives, had become a matter of concern. U.S. Army in World War II cross-channel attack. The progress of the Allied armies in Normandy can be organised into a number of phases. To use such phasing is useful if only in the interests of clarity, for with hundreds of units fighting in an ever-expanding area along a 50-mile front, it is otherwise hard to see any pattern in the fighting or gain any sense of what the various commanders were trying to achieve. The first of these phases had been accomplished on D-Day, when the Allied armies got ashore. The second phase came on June 7th, when no major counterattack developed, and the Allies were able to consolidate their initial gains and secure their various beachheads. Now came Phase 3, the battle to join these 5 beachheads into one continuous bridgehead. No one knew how long this phase would last, but while it went on, it was also necessary to pour troops and supplies ashore. The post-D-Day build-up phase was essentially a race. While the Allies were sending troops and supplies ashore, the Germans were bringing their reserves forward from deeper in France and making every effort to prevent the Allied build-up being completed. They did not apparently appreciate that this was the main, indeed the only, landing in the north, and that all their available forces should have been sent against it. Even so, the beachheads were soon being attacked. German aircraft, chased from the beachhead skies by day, returned at night to bomb the beaches and assembly areas and drop mines offshore. German E-boats, patrol craft and submarines appeared nightly to take their toll of Allied shipping. Neither should the battle for the bridgehead be seen simply as a matter of linking up the beachheads laterally along the shoreline. It was also necessary to expand the beachheads inland to peg out claims, or there would be no space ashore for all the various fighting units and logistical elements needed for the eventual breakout. Gaining ground inland was therefore a strategic necessity. Possessing ground gave the invaders room to manoeuvre, enabled them to absorb counterattacks, provided space for more troops and supply dumps, and freed the beaches from direct, observed artillery fire. Within a few days, it was found advisable to haul down the barrage balloons over the beaches, as these provided German artillery observers with something to aim at. In the face of intensifying enemy opposition, the expansion inland would take time, but it is notable. See the introductory quote from the U.S. history given above that as early as June 8th-D+2. The powers that be in Britain were already getting impatient with their forces ashore, urging faster progress and failing to realise that expanding the beachheads would not be easy in the face of German resistance and the ongoing problems of supply. On that day, the US troop build-up was already 20,000 soldiers short, only 50% of the planned number of vehicles had landed, and less than 75% of the necessary stores had reached the fighting men, and yet people at Schaeff, safe in London, complained about a lack of progress. Only Montgomery seems to have appreciated this point. It was inevitable that after the successful outcome of the assault, the pace of operations slowed down, he wrote. The assault formations needed time for a breather while they reorganised and reabsorbed the echelons which had been left behind for the first days, but without which a unit cannot function for long. The build-up was falling behind schedule, and this added to our difficulties. The build-up fell behind for a number of reasons, some of which, like damage to landing craft, bad weather, enemy action, and too tight a time schedule, have been touched on in the previous chapter. Delays should anyway have been anticipated by all concerned. None of these reasons were unusual, but none of them were taken into account in the pre-D-Day planning. It was inevitable that the original plan would soon get somewhat out of phase, but the biggest obstacle to any Allied progress off the beaches was predictably the enemy. In spite of major deception operations such as Fortitude and the destruction of bridges and rail links into Normandy, the German forces in Normandy had been substantially increased in the weeks before the landing, most notably by the arrival of the 352nd and 91st Divisions on the Calvados coast and the introduction of the 243rd Division in the Cotentin. The Germans also had 10 panzer or motorised divisions available to reinforce the defenders around the beachheads, and those already mentioned, Panzer Lehr, 21 Panzer, 17 SS Panzer Grenadier and 12 SS Panzer were to be reinforced by 116 Panzer from 15th Army, north of the Seine, 2nd Panzer from Picardy, 11 Panzer from Bordeaux, 1 SS Panzer from Belgium, 2 SS Panzer, Das Reich, from Toulouse, and 9 Panzer from Avignon. All these crack divisions were now heading for Normandy. There were also 5 infantry divisions, including 2 parachute divisions coming forward, so in the build-up race between attacker and defender, the defenders appeared to be winning. 12 SS Panzer, Panzer Lehr, and 17 SS Panzer Grenadier Division were in the line on June 7th, 9th and 12th, respectively. But the actions of the first 2 units resulted from the initiatives of the divisional commanders, rather than OB West, and they were committed without any coherent plan. At least to begin with, they simply attacked the Allied forces where found. With the Allies at large across Normandy, from the Bois de Bavante to Sainte-Mère-Église, the German defenders were fully occupied in mustering their forces, pouring in reserves and attacking any invaders they encountered. The task of establishing a firm defensive line and preparing a coordinated strategy for driving the invaders back into the sea must wait until it was certain where the invaders actually were, and the defenders were also sure that this Normandy attack was the main landing and not a diversion before the major assault in the Pas-de-Calais. As a result, the main German effort in the first days after the landings was a series of strong but uncoordinated attacks around the beachhead, spearheaded by 21st Panzer, 12th SS Panzer and Panzer Lehr, largely concentrated against the British and Canadians in the east and the US 5th Corps pushing south from Omaha. Thanks to Allied air power and naval gunfire support, these attacks, if vicious and pressed home hard, were beaten off. That said, the Germans managed to hold on to Caen and restrict the Allied advance inland in other areas, with the exception already noted of the 50th Division advance on Bayeux and the advances made by the US 7th Corps into the Cotentin from Utah. In the Cotentin, German efforts to intervene against the parachute divisions and the US troops landing on Utah were largely negated by their own pre-D-Day defences. By landing behind the flooded areas along the Merderet River west of Sainte-Mère-Église and around the Vire floods between Isigny and Carentan, the 7th Corps units, airborne and seaborne, had a defence line behind which they could muster. The 101st Airborne established a strong defensive position behind the River Vire, and the actions fought around Carentan from D+1 to D+7 cut both ways. The Americans had difficulty taking Carentan and linking up with the troops from Omaha, but on the other hand the Germans had difficulty feeding forces into the Cotentin from the south, either to reinforce the troops attempting to seal off Utah or bolster the garrison of Cherbourg. This being so, the first task for the 7th Corps, having linked up with the 5th Corps, was to head west, reach the Atlantic coast, and cut the Cotentin Peninsula. Once the Americans had cut the Cotentin, they could turn their full power north and take Cherbourg against no more opposition than the troops already in the Cotentin could provide, and it was vitally important to do this, for Cherbourg was one of the ports needed for supply. Jack Capel of the 4th Infantry Division tells of this time, "The fight up to Cherbourg and through Montebourg was hard, for the Germans fought back for every yard of ground and caused heavy casualties. War was seen to be serious, and about this time we first heard about the $1 million wound, the one that got you home, but was not serious enough to maim or kill you. That was hard too. Atterbury, one of the men in my wire section, was hit in the buttocks by a piece of shrapnel, and since it did not appear serious, we gathered round to congratulate him as he lay on the ground, smiling, awaiting evacuation to England. Next day we asked the medic how he had got on, and he told us Atterbury had died in the aid station. On D+5, Colonel Red Reeder of the 12th Infantry Regiment was hit near Montebourg. I was talking to some reinforcements who had just arrived from England, young kids, and then a single shell exploded over my head, and that was it. My left leg was horribly mangled above the ankle, and my left elbow was torn open. I screamed. I could not help it. But Bill Mills, one of my officers, though wounded himself, gave me a shot of morphine from his first aid kit. His own blood splashed on me as he did so. I lay in the dirt for some 15 minutes before a jeep came up carrying 6 wounded men, and eventually I ended up in a hospital, a big black tent, where General Collins loomed up and pinned the Distinguished Service Cross on my shirt. The 4 areas of interest for General Montgomery in the days immediately after the landing were A. The Bois de Bavent-Ranville area on the left flank of the invasion, which must be held in case 15th Army came in. B. The road from Sword to Caen beside the River Orne. C. Attempts by the Canadians, British and Americans to get inland and peg out claims to the south from Juno, Gold and Omaha, not least to provide suitable ground for airfields, and D. In the west, the US efforts to cut the Cotentin and move north on Cherbourg. The Bavent-Ranville-Salonelles area was held from early on D-Day by the British 6th Airborne Division, reinforced as related by Lovat's 1st Commando Brigade and later by the 4th Commando Brigade as well. These parachute and commando soldiers were assault troops par excellence, and in an ideal world would have been quickly replaced by heavy infantry and armoured units and withdrawn to the UK. However, as the beachheads came under increasing pressure, as casualties mounted and Caen remained untaken, this withdrawal did not happen. Like their American counterparts in the west of the beachhead, the British paratroopers and commandos stayed in the line east of the Orne until mid-August and the Allied breakout. Among their number was Lieutenant Brian Samain of E Troop, 45, Royal Marine Commando. I was a 19-year-old subaltern when I joined 45 in Normandy, one of a small group of replacements sent in after the casualties in the fighting to secure the beachhead. As we drove up to Amfreville, we passed the evidence of battle, smashed and abandoned German guns and tanks, Achtung Minen skull and crossbones signs for minefields. As we got closer, we began to hear the sound of the guns, and across the Orne on the plain were the remains of wrecked gliders, like broken model aeroplanes, lying about at crazy angles. I met the CO, Nicole Gray, and was sent to E Troop where the OC was Major Ian Beadle, and because I had done a sniper course in England, I was made sniper officer as well as commanding a section of E Troop. There were 4 snipers in 45, all of them excellent shots with many kills to their credit. Commando snipers were in action daily, working singly or in pairs. Marine Cakebread of 45 was one of the most successful snipers in the brigade. The other was an army commando, and he accounted for more than 30 Germans in the course of the Normandy campaign. There was constant mortaring and shelling by the Germans, to which we replied in kind, but the emphasis on our side, certainly in the commando brigade, was on fighting patrols, raids and sniping, all to maintain the initiative and make it difficult for the Germans to mount an attack. The Germans were also active snipers, and as their line faced west, they would snipe at us in the mornings when their backs were to the sun, often concealing themselves in high trees difficult to detect in the foliage. We had to move about with great care. The heights east of the Orne, which are occupied by the Bois de Bavent and a series of small villages, Ranville, Touffreville, Le Mesnil, Bréville, Salonelles and lower down Merville, are not particularly high, but they occupy a ridge that runs inland from the coast towards Troarn, and this ridge dominates much of the ground between the rivers Orne and Dives. By June 8th, most of the airborne troops still alive and uncaptured had rejoined their units in this area, and, reinforced by the 2 commando brigades, 6th Airborne dug in on the heights, ready to fend off attacks on the left flank of Sword Beach, attacks which began, as related, on the evening of June 6th. During the evening tide on June 6th and on June 7th, the 2nd Army follow-up forces arrived, notably the 7th Armoured Division, Desert Rats, and the 51st Highland Division. These veteran units had served with 8th Army in the Western Desert, and much was expected of them as the Desert Rats were sent inland towards Tilly-sur-Seulles, and 51st Highland were sent east of the Orne to support 6th Airborne. While they were moving forward on June 8th, 13 Para were attacked in the 6th Airborne perimeter beyond the Orne, and on June 10th, a strong force of infantry and tanks from the 346th Division came up from beyond Bréville and attempted to reach the bridges at Bénouville. This attack was beaten off by the 7th Para and the 13th Para. the latter putting in bayonet charges across the cornfields and causing heavy losses to the German 858th Grenadier Regiment. These scattered actions were a sign of growing German strength around the airborne perimeter beyond the Orne. From June 10th, these attacks continued, many mounted from the village of Breville, which the Germans had managed to retain. Brigadier Hill of the 3rd Parachute Brigade later declared that the fighting for Breville between June 8th and 12th were 5 of the toughest days of fighting I had in the war, and the situation was not helped by the fact that the parachute units were very short of men. Lieutenant Colonel Otway of the 9th Parachute Battalion had attacked the Merville Battery on D-Day with only 60 men. 2 days later he had 90 men, but even by June 12th, when more men scattered in the jump had come in, his battalion could only muster 270 soldiers. Nevertheless, these airborne battalions held their ground tenaciously and beat off enemy attacks with loss. Lieutenant Dixie Dean, the mortar and machine gun officer of the 13th Parachute Regiment, has some accounts of this time. The morning of June 7th was reasonably quiet, with only sporadic shelling on the south side of Ranville, and we must have been out of range of any mortars since we were not bothered by them. But it was always artillery from the direction of Saint-Honorine, near to Caen, that troubled us. All the action was away to our left as the Oxen Bucks cleared the bridgehead. They cleared the Boche out of Hérouvillette, but he was determined to hold on to Escoville, and the light infantry had heavy casualties in their attempt to take it. We did have a bit of a panic on the afternoon of the 8th, when the word came that German tanks were crossing the bridges. If true, this was serious because it meant our lifeline to the seaborne forces was cut, and we waited in our slit trenches, gammon bombs in hand. It turned out that the tanks were Allied tanks, much better news. Then we were told that there might be very heavy shelling as the 51st Highland Division were going to attack Saint-Honorine, and how right it was. We experienced the first heavy bombardment. The attack failed, and when I went up later to see what had happened, all I saw were dead bodies. We had seen no civilians, but one evening a middle-aged Frenchwoman turned up in the platoon area, and I was just able to understand that she wanted to see her house in the village. I detailed someone to accompany her, just in case she was up to no good, and the house she claimed was one at the end of a row which had received a direct hit and had a great gaping hole at the gable end. She was soon back, ranting and raving at me because of the damage to her property, and appeared to hold me personally responsible for the damage, demanding to know why we had come to Normandy to fight the war. All the other wars had been fought elsewhere in France, so why had we not gone there? She really meant it, but considering Ranville was in the front line, the damage to the houses was negligible compared with a lot of other villages we saw later. In an attempt to lance the Boil of Breville, on June 11th, Major General Richard Gale ordered 3 Para-Brigade, supported by the 5th Battalion, the Black Watch from 51st Highland, to clear the village. The Highlanders duly went in, accompanied by their pipers, but were caught in the open cornfields by German machine guns and promptly cut to pieces, the remnants taking cover with the 9th Parachute Regiment. On the following day, clearly encouraged by this success, the Germans mounted an attack on the 9th Parachute Battalion, beginning with artillery concentrations during the morning, followed up in mid-afternoon with a full-scale attack from infantry, tanks, and self-propelled guns. This attack was finally driven off by a company of the Canadian Parachute Battalion, led forward in person by Brigadier Hill. General Gale decided that the Germans might well be exhausted by this day of heavy fighting, so at midnight he committed his reserve battalion, 12th Para, and a company of the Devonshire Regiment, added a tank squadron of the 13th 18th Hussars, and ordered them to take Breville. The men were briefed for the attack in the church at Amfreville and moved up to the start line at 10 p.m., arriving in time to observe the start of the artillery bombardment supporting their attack. Some of the shells fell short and landed among the assault troops, one wounding Brigadier Lord Lovat of the Commando Brigade and Brigadier Lord Kindersley of the 6th Air Landing Brigade. Both survived but had to be evacuated. Chaos duly reigned, but by dawn on June 12th, Breville had been occupied and came firmly into British hands next morning with the arrival of the 1st Battalion Royal Ulster Rifles. The 12th Parachute Battalion was now reduced to 55 men, but like the other parachute units, it stayed in the line. The fighting on the eastern perimeter of the landing area would continue until almost the end of the Normandy campaign, but after June 12th there was no real likelihood that the position east of the Orne would be lost. General Gale of the 6th Airborne wrote later, "There is a turning point in all battles. In the fight for the Orne bridgehead, the Battle of Breville was that turning point. Neither in the north nor in the south were we ever seriously attacked again. This was fortunate. While Gale and his men were battling at Breville and securing the left flank of the Allied bridgehead, Montgomery was launching another push on Caen, avoiding the strong northern defences for an attempt west of the city, a continuation of attacks that had been going on since the Second Army came ashore. Second Army's failure to take Caen on D-Day has become one of the great controversies of the Normandy campaign, and one might fairly point out that if the 3rd Infantry Division did not take the city on June 6th, it was not for want of trying. These efforts continued until the city fell. A second attempt on Caen was mounted on June 7th and 8th. This attack was spearheaded by the 158th Brigade of the 3rd British Infantry Division, which thrust directly up the Orne towards Caen and got as far as the village of Lebessay, 2 miles from the city, before they were driven back with heavy casualties by 21st Panzer. Frontal attacks on Caen were clearly going to be costly, so some other way of taking the city had to be found, and after the eastern end of the bridgehead had been secured at Breville on June 12th, the focus of activity switched to another attempt to outflank Caen at Villers-Bocage. General Montgomery came ashore on June 8th and established his headquarters in the grounds of the Château of Cruilly, northwest of Caen, reporting to London later that day. "The Germans are doing everything they can to hold on to Caen, and I have decided not to have a lot of casualties butting up against the place. So I have ordered Second Army to keep up the pressure and to make its main effort towards Villers-Bocage and Évrecy, and thence southeast towards Falaise. It is hard to see anything wrong with this decision, though lightly introducing Falaise, a town well south of Caen, into this report was probably unwise. The German defences north of Caen were getting stronger by the hour. 21 Panzer, Panzerlehr and 12 SS Panzer were now deployed or deploying there, and even if the city was taken by direct assault, such success could only lead to days of street fighting, a form of warfare which is notoriously hard on the attacking infantry. This is so for any town, but Caen would be a particularly hard nut to crack. The River Orne runs right through the centre, and the Caen Canal runs into it, both offering a good defensive line among the narrow streets and old houses, while the medieval castle in the centre seemed impervious to bombs and shell fire. Nor was the city easy to outflank. South of the city lay the tumbled country of the Suisse Normande, which limited the scope for an attack from that direction, so, provided the pressure was kept up in front of Caen to hold the panzer divisions in place, it made good tactical sense to mask Caen, outflank the defenders, and leave them to be dealt with by air power, while the main battle shifted southeast towards Falaise. This scheme depended on the British being able to break through on either side of the city, and the first attempt to do this was made on the western side of Caen, through Tilly-sur-Seulles towards Villers-Bocage. The prospects of success for a flanking attack west of Caen were not good. By June 7th, the 3rd Canadian Division, fighting west of Caen, was having plenty of trouble with the 12th SS Panzer, which disputed every metre of ground and, as ordered by Adolf Hitler, counterattacked immediately to retake any ground lost. Between D-Day and D+6, the Canadians lost almost 3,000 men in the fighting for Carpiquet, but on June 9th, 12 SS broke off their attack. The Canadians' dogged resistance to the German panzers had taken its toll of attacker and defender, and for the moment at least, the situation on the Canadian Division's front was a stalemate. West of the Canadians lay the British 50th Division, which, having taken Bayeux on June 7th, was moving south towards Tilly-sur-Seulles, while edging west to keep in touch with the US 1st Infantry Division moving out of Omaha. 50th Division had done very well on D-Day and D+1, but was now slowing down. Like the other assault divisions, it had been fighting continuously since D-Day and needed rest and reinforcements before it could push forward aggressively. Here was the classic post-assault dilemma. The divisions committed on D-Day had been training for months for the landing. They knew, or had been told, that getting ashore was only part of it, and that their battle would continue. But inevitably there was a feeling about that, if they could punch a breach in the Atlantic wall, get ashore and stay there, they would have done their bit, at least for a while. The advance would then be taken up by fresh, well-ordered follow-up formations that would come ashore without opposition. This is the classic pattern for any attack. The assault formations take the position and the follow-up formations, kept in reserve, come forward to exploit it. That is what reserves are for. Although they were tired, the problem for these assault divisions was emotional rather than physical. They had been given a task and accomplished it. Now they were given another task, one for which they were not mentally prepared, and their advance inevitably slowed. Moreover, the opposition was increasing. From June 7th, the German fightback was being taken up by fresh divisions which, though harassed from the air, had not been pounded by the guns of the fleet, or surprised by the Allied landing or driven out of their positions in the D-Day fighting. By June 8th, the Allied assault divisions, tired and somewhat disordered, were being confronted by some of the finest and best-equipped divisions in the German army. It is hardly surprising if the Allied advance slowed down. On the 30th Corps front, those units moving out of Bayeux in the direction of Tilly-sur-Seulles, due west of Caen, on June 10th ran abruptly into General Bayerlein's crack Panzer Lehr, coming into the line on the left of 12th SS Panzer, and Montgomery's first attempt to outflank Caen came virtually to a standstill in the village of Saint-Pierre, just east of Tilly. The order to advance on Tilly-sur-Seulles came to the 7th Armoured Division, Desert Rats, on June 10th, and the division moved forward, led by the 4th County of London Yeomanry, 4th CLY, in Cromwell tanks. The enemy was first encountered at the village of Jerusalem, 5 miles south of Bayeux, where the Desert Rats had their first taste of bocage fighting. Since the men of this division were more used to the open deserts of North Africa, it is hardly surprising that they did not like it. Lurking in the dense hedgerows and narrow lanes, small groups of German infantry, equipped with Panzerfausts and automatic weapons, and sometimes backed by a tank, brought the 7th Armoured advance to a halt. There was also a tactical mistake. The 7th Armoured's supporting infantry, the Queen's Brigade, had been ordered to bring up the rear, and when the tanks ran into opposition, it took time to get the foot soldiers forward to winkle the Germans out of their positions. As a result, little progress was made, and at the end of the day the Desert Rats had lost just 4 tanks and suffered very few casualties, 2 facts that caused some critical comment when their lack of progress was noted as well. The division did no better on the following day, June 11th, although their tactics had improved. 2 battle groups of tanks and infantry were formed, one to advance on Tilly, one to take Langevre, east of Tilly, on the road to Balleroy. These attacks got nowhere, and a heavy counter-attack that night by German infantry backed with tanks caused heavy casualties, 150 killed and wounded to the 2nd Battalion, the Essex Regiment. Many British soldiers were to claim later that the German infantry was reluctant to fight at night, but there was little sign of that here, and the Germans only fell back when the Essex called down a heavy artillery barrage on their own position. 7th Armoured Division were not the only ones in trouble at this time. 50th Division was making very little progress, either while the attack of the 3rd Canadian Division, supported by the 6th Canadian Armoured Regiment, is described in the British official history as a costly failure. The Canadians lost 37 tanks on June 11th, and 96 of their supporting infantry were killed or wounded. Beating their heads against the enemy defences at such cost was clearly unproductive, so it was decided to shift the 7th Armoured to the west, outflank the enemy defences in the bocage around Tilly, and come in on the small town of Villers-Bocage along a high ridge that lay behind Panzer Lehr's main position. This move began on June 12th. By that night the 7th Armoured were at Livry, 5 miles from Villers-Bocage, ready to move in next day and get beyond the town. On the following day the leading tanks made good progress, and by noon on June 13th they had entered the outskirts of Villers-Bocage. There had been little opposition so far that morning, but a fresh German armoured division, 2nd Panzer, had now arrived in Normandy, and the two armoured divisions bumped into each other in the streets of the town where a furious tank and infantry battle developed. One of the first tanks into Villers-Bocage that day was a Sherman Firefly commanded by Sergeant Bobby Rommel of the 4th CLY. Most of us were in Cromwell's, which I still think was a useless tank, fast enough but without adequate armour and undergunned. Fortunately, I had a Sherman Firefly, which had the British 17-pounder gun, and we could take on anything. As you know, we landed on D+1 and advanced on Tilly. From there we were ordered to take Villers-Bocage and the high ground beyond it, and had our troubles, but, well, June 13th was the fatal day. We had leaguered the night before at Livry, a bit east of Caumont, and were on the move by first light, against no opposition to speak of, at least at first. Brigade said Villers was clear, and although the colonel wanted to do a recce first, Looney Hinder, the brigadier, came up and ordered us to push straight on into the town. So, a squadron pushed on and got onto the heights beyond the town, so far so good. RHQ and the recce troop stayed in the town centre, and B, my squadron, stayed out to the west with C squadron between us. All went well until mid-morning, when I first heard the sound of an 88mm gun, which is something you don't forget, believe me. A vicious crack, and that was the first hint that the enemy were about. The Tiger came out and started to beat us up. First it wiped out the artillery tanks. These were radio-equipped, with no gun, so they could do nothing. Then the Tiger wiped out the recce troop and came on until it ran into my colleague, Sergeant Lockwood, who was in a Firefly, and he engaged it. He did not do any damage, but he certainly scared it off. However, that was only part of it. By now, other German tanks were at work attacking A squadron beyond the town. They blew up the leading tank in one column and then knocked out the one at the back. Then, having jammed the column, they simply rolled down the line, gunning each of our tanks in turn, knocking them out or setting them aflame, killing or capturing a lot of our chaps. Frankly, Villers-Bocage was a bloody shambles. The CO was off the air, so Ibby Aird took charge and ordered my troop 3 Troop of B Squadron into the town. Having a Firefly, I was in the lead in case we met Tigers, and Captain Bill Cotton, who died a few years ago, was our squadron OC. Bill was a fearless chap. We got into the centre all right, but soon afterwards 3 German tanks came rolling down the main street. The one in the lead was a Mark IV. You might hear that it was a Tiger, but I fired at it and can assure you that it wasn't, though I missed, incidentally. Fortunately, the 6-pounder anti-tank gunners of the Queen's, our infantry brigade, were on hand by now, and they knocked it out. However, the next tank along certainly was a Tiger. I had reversed a bit and could see it coming through the windows of the corner house in the square, and we engaged it through the windows with armour-piercing. This made a terrible mess of the house, but we knocked it out. It was now about midday, I suppose, and there was fighting going on all over the town, tanks engaged, infantry dodging about, anti-tank guns in action in the streets, lots of mortaring and small arms fire, with the Queen's infantry fighting with German tanks and German infantry coming up from the south. Then another German tank, another Tiger, came up, around the corner of the square. It was too close to get the gun sight on it, but I had already sighted the gun by removing the breech block and lining up the barrel on a sign stuck on the wall across the road. When the Tiger blocked that sign, I fired, and that was that. Up it went. We pulled out at nightfall and went back to the village of Amaye-sur-Seulles, near Tracy-Bocage, west of Villers-Bocage, and counted the cost. The regiment had been mauled. We lost our CO, Colonel Onslow, all of a squadron, most of the recce troop, the RHQ, a lot of good people. Villers-Bocage was a hard battle, believe me, and that night we withdrew to Amaye-sur-Seulles, a little west of Villers, and went into Liga. For knocking out 3 German tanks in the streets of Villers-Bocage, Sergeant Bobby Bramall was later awarded the military medal. In that day-long brawl in Villers-Bocage, 7th Armoured Division lost 25 tanks, 14 armoured cars, and 14 Bren gun carriers. Much of the damage hereabouts was done by 2 Tiger tank companies of the 501 SS Heavy Tank Battalion, commanded by Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, one of the most notable panzer commanders of the war, who was to be killed later in the Normandy battle. The 7th Armoured were thrusting into territory held by 2 German panzer divisions, Panzer Lehr and 2nd Panzer, and until their 33rd Armoured Brigade came up, they could do no more.